Okay, our panel today consists of Arturo and Yarish, who will speak first, Dan Neuspiel, and Gregory Diamant. And they'll each limit themselves to no more than 20 minutes, so that we'll have a full hour for discussion forward. So, Arturo first.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for the introduction.
You want to use that?
No, that's okay. Perhaps I'll walk around a bit. Before I even begin, I would like to reference Gregory's last presentation, which you can find on our website, called Justice, and it's very well worth a read because Gregory sets out the broad pattern of cultural, historic references to economic changes that occur in the United States that had the propensity at that time to ignite aspirations for a fascist coup, in fact. What I would like to do this morning is to focus fascism in its historical context, so-called philosophical rationales, and its very deep historic roots in capitalism, which Gregory explains in his paper. I urge everyone to read that. However, before we can even approach the topic, we have to ask ourselves, what is fascism? Because so many people are not quite sure. Fascism, most of us reference with Mussolini, with Giovanni Gentile in Italy, without fully understanding the Italian context. It's not my purpose here to explain Italian history, but to set fascism, first of all, in the Italian context, when it was in fact innovative. Many people, including Franklin Roosevelt, commended Mussolini. This is a broader context that we have to place for our discussion of understanding what is fascism. We also have to confront terms such as classic fascism, what was formed, and we can even say experimentally, in Italy from about 1919, the March on Rome, and the seizure of power shortly after, or the capitulation of rendering to Mussolini and the fascist power in 1920-21. However, we also have to take account of the fact that fascism in Italy was an experiment supported by many popular groups, including anarchists, Georges Sorel in France. People weren't quite sure what fascism was at that time. We also have to ask ourselves, what is the language being used today? Neo-fascism, post-fascism. And to help with that discussion, what I've prepared is a small packet which I'll explain. In the packet, as I said, not to be read now, but just to be referenced, I selected two readings which I think are very comprehensive, each in their own way. First of all, the first Nazi Hydra in America, commended by Howard Zinn, written by Glenn Yearwood and John Hawkins. The work, the detailed work that these two authors accomplished is worth 10 readings, because most of us, estimating that we're a whole bunch of baby boomers here, still in our youth, right? With that kind of necessary energy. to go out and have dinner and dance after we do this. What they accomplish is an unearthing of a much hidden history, as it said, suppressed history. If you flip to that, I offer a suggestion for a reading in Italian history. It's very brief, and you don't have to be an expert in Italian history. However, when we study fascism in any form, whether it's its emergence in Germany, or Italy, or Hungary today, or as it began to emerge in England at about the same time as in Germany in the 30s. We need to make a particular national study. It's in the context of the national, cultural, economic environment that history takes its forms, and it mutates and adapts itself to the conditions that exist within the nation. This is also much misunderstood because many authors have written what they call the fascist minimum. Some authors have 5 points, 10 points, 20 points. I selected one which you can find from the suppressed history. I copied it for you, and that summary is about 25 points of what Britt Lawrence, or Lawrence Britt, compiled as the fascist minimum plus a bit of an extension from his point of view. Once again, not to be reading while we're in a presentation or discussion. This I offer to you as a recommendation for later reading, and a reading of the 3 books that I copied for you in the covers here. However, to contrast the fascist minimum a bit with what was actually written by Mussolini and Giovanni Gentile, and then later by Hitler and Karl Schutz, Schutz or Schmidt. Schmidt, right? You will find in the appendices that I've attached what they had to say in 1920 and 1925. And the reason I copied this, I bring your attention for our present reference to I bring your attention to what was written in German, because both the fascists in Italy and the Germans had to make a popular appeal of some sort. They had to draw in popular support, as the Republican right radicals are trying to do today. And astonishingly for us, they appealed to the anarchists. The anarchists. In Italy, fascists enjoyed widespread support among anarchists. And of course, the middle class, as in Germany and in Italy. However, to help confuse us a little more, when you have time, read the social program of the Nazis. The social program of the Nazis has appeal, and the elements, and not to condemn the emerging socialists in the United States, has the same appeal that's being presented in the United States. the Nazis were able to, and the fascists particularly, were able to accomplish almost universal health care. Of course, the Nazis had to get rid of around 6 to 8 million people to accomplish. Jews, Serbs, and so on. But that was the appeal. Housing. They attacked the Jewish-owned, many times Jewish-owned, and in Italy, the newly emerging department stores as a Jewish conspiracy, and then to distribute the units, housing units, apartment units, and stores to loyal party members. Finance was repeatedly attacked. High finance. But only Jews were attacked. And you'll read in this. If you eliminate reference to the exclusion of Jews in the Nazis' 1925 program, written by Hitler and Carl Schmitt, you can almost feel the same type of program that is being presented in the United States in even a diluted form. We haven't even reached that level of capacity. We're not even yet excluding minorities, blacks, and Muslims, and certainly Mexicans who are paying their taxes in full. So we must be careful as we listen today to what was accomplished, and we're not even approaching it. So I begin now with that, following that little introduction. And in the case of a similar situation to Johnny Carson's show, I warm up the stage for these guys. Many of you are here because you're probably not only interested, but you read the article. I make reference to two parts of this article. Where does the project, the fascist project, fit? We're referring to 20th, first century fascism. And how does capitalism fit into the mix? Well, my position, you don't have to search for my thesis, I'll tell you right out. Fascism's culprit. Fascism, historic capitalism has in its operations, in what the author V calls the search for order. Capitalism in its earlier competitive stage, shall we say, in earlier England, very early 19th century, the United States, had elements of competition. Following the Civil War, those elements of competition were being consolidated, literally, by the New York bankers. And the center of banking in the United States from the time of the first manipulative trades of the new money unit called the United States dollar on Wall Street under the so-called buttonwood tree was a manipulation of funds to literally consolidate financial power in Wall Street for want of another place. Wall Street, the financial district of New York, became and remained through World War II and into the present, the power center. So what does capitalism, why does capitalism in its chaos and its search to get out of that chaos to find some kind of order to a system capitalists can't control. How does this begin to give rise to what we can call kindly organized capitalism, the search for order, and later on, following World War II with greater intensity, managed capitalism? Most of capitalist enterprises in the United States, taking Ford for example, were self-financing, internal financing, self-generated. However, as Marx pointed out once, with the invention of credit, or the rediscovery of credit in the 19th century, the bankers inject themselves into the accumulation process. They take a cut in various forms. We may call it interest, we may call it finding fees, managerial fees, merger fees. There's endless terminology. Basically, they take their cut. And with the injection of credit into the economy, the capitalists have to figure out how, and they didn't know, they have to figure out how to manage their cash flow. Any person here who worked in a grocery store knows what it means to manage.
3 minutes.
Means, that's all, I used 20 minutes already? Jeez. So fast. But later on, I guess I get to participate in a discussion, which I hope I'm provoking. But in that search for order, in that search to manage credit, to pay creditors, to avoid bankruptcy, 1917, 1907, the emergence of the Fed, and a tremendous effort done in secret to hand over the entire banking system of the United States to private capital and call it what we might call today public-private enterprise, where in fact the capitalists totally control all of the financial affairs. So they determine interest rates, they determine the value of money. Now they determine the international value of money. So the capitalist, whether it's a big capitalist or a small capitalist, has to conform to the standards set by the banking system. Because now, as Monthly Review has argued for the past 40 years under various titles and authors, the economy has been financialized. It is under the total control of the financial system. And herein lies, or therein lies, the impetus for the fascist control of money, fascist control of the economy, because when the system begins to choke, 1930s, 2008, which we lived through, the fix now is to expand the money supply, which may be, for example, called qualitative easing, 1, 2, 3, and so on, to the point that the Queen has, Queen number 2, Elizabeth number 2. Well, what does all this mean? Why couldn't you guys figure this out before? The reason they can't figure it out is because capitalism cannot be controlled, and not only can it not be controlled, but when it reaches the choke point, at the verge of a crisis, and later in the discussions I can elaborate. It begins to call in forces, as Smedley Butler once called, the military control, or the gangsters for capitalism. Who are the gangsters for capitalism? They're the fascists in very big forms.
Okay, all right, thank you. Now I'll give the floor to Dan for his 20 minutes.
Thank you. Fire up my iPad here. Thank you all. Well, Arturo gave a lot of interesting detail on history of fascism, and I'd like to bring us more up to date on 21st century fascism. And I'm going to focus particularly on Europe, even though we have a lot of interest, I'm sure all of us, in right-wing trends in the U.S. But as some of you know, I have a particular interest in Europe because my father and his family were victims of European fascism about 80 years ago. And Europe, of course, was the birthplace of fascism. Let me start by talking about, yes?
Could you speak out to us?
Oh, yes.
We can hear that you're talking, but they can't hear.
Okay.
Wow.
I will. Let me stand up. That's
We
fine.
want to hear what you have to say.
Okay. So, the European Union had parliamentary elections about 2 months ago, and they revealed the fraying alliance between the U.S. and the EU, as well as the weakening of U.S. imperialism and its neoliberal world order that had previously been dominant since the end of World War II. The EU voting also exposed the growth of openly fascist movements and the widening of conflicts within the capitalist classes of the most important countries of the EU. It also underlined the urgent agenda for the predominant wing of the European capitalists as they move toward the next global military conflict. The instability and splintering within longtime U.S. allies like Germany, France, and Britain, alongside the sharpening rivalry between the U.S. and rising imperialists in China and Russia, raises the likelihood of war. That's how imperialists solve their contradictions, even if only temporarily. At the same time, this volatile period offers a strong opportunity for leftists to organize a new revolutionary movement to militantly oppose imperialist war. The old guard European leadership includes the French banker president Emmanuel Macron, Germany's lame duck chancellor Angela Merkel, and Britain's imploding conservative labor establishment. These leaders want to continue to ally with the U.S. mainline capitalists. The dominant capitalists, whose multinational alliances like the EU and NATO protect their long-term imperialist profits, continue to hold lethal state power in both the U.S. and most of Europe. They're still the main threat to the international working class. If anything, the far right's recent surge enhances the ability of liberals and social democrats to mislead workers into backing the so-called lesser of two evils instead of creating an international revolutionary working class movement. In my view, fascism is the ultimate result of the dictatorship of finance capital when, for a variety of reasons, the ruling class can no longer function with a semblance of democracy. At the moment, the dominant progressive neoliberal capitalists are under siege from more domestically oriented capitalists, whom Nancy Fraser has called hyper-reactionary neoliberals. This latter group, represented by Trump in the US and by a growing number of international autocrats supported by right-wing populist movements, is made up of crudely racist nationalists who share an isolationist, short-term, profit-taking outlook. They don't want to be taxed for the next big war because their investments are less directly tied to imperialism. As finance capital finds its core interests threatened, the mainline capitalists may resort to fascism to unite and discipline their own ranks. Then they will intensify their attacks on the working class in preparation for the next war. The growing split between these two camps can be seen in the EU parliamentary election results, and I'll give just a few examples. In Germany, the ruling main-wing coalition parties, the Christian Democrats and Social Democrats, both took major hits. The reactionary anti-immigrant Alternative for Germany made gains in Eastern Germany, while the outsider Liberal Greens grew among the young urban voters, mainly in the West. In Italy, the openly fascist anti-immigrant League, led by Matteo Salvini, swept the field and won more than a third of the vote, expanding from its base in the north and more than doubling its support in just 1 year. In France, Marine Le Pen's national rally won big on an anti-immigrant platform, mainly in rural areas, defeating Macron's En Marche party, which remained strong in cities. In Britain, Nigel Farage's anti-EU Brexit party, formed just 6 weeks earlier, won an easy victory. The Conservative and Labour parties, which together represent London-based finance capital, combined for just 23% of the vote. In general, the centrist coalition that has led the European Parliament for decades lost its majority of seats, declining from 54 to 43%. The EU, made up of 28 European countries, or 27 when Britain leaves, was created in 1993 to counter the almighty rule of US imperialism in the post-Soviet era. The EU is essentially a borderless union created to increase capitalist profits through a free flow of goods and labor. On that level, the EU has up to now worked exceedingly well for the European finance capitalists. The EU's trade structure has propelled it to become the world's second largest economy after China. Most recent data show that the EU produced $19.9 trillion, China $23.1 trillion, and the US was third, producing $19.4 trillion. As the EU rulers attempt to cope with both their struggling economies and waning political influence, some are turning toward China and Russia and away from the weakening US for trade, alliances, and security. A number of countries are actively hedging their bets. In fact, the escalating trade war between the US and China appears to be pushing much of the EU toward the China camp. In the face of expanding influence by Russia and China in Europe, the political representatives of the dominant French and German financial classes have used their tenuous victory in the EU elections to install like-minded bureaucrats at the head of the EU. German Defense Minister Ursula von der Leyen and Angela Merkel, protege, who backs a strong European military, was appointed president of the EU's executive body. Christine Lagarde, former French finance minister and chief of the US-dominated International Monetary Fund, was nominated as the next head of the European Central Bank. Meanwhile, Europe's open fascists seem to be pivoting toward Russia. In a recent scandal in Austria, the deputy prime minister and leader of the far-right Freedom Party was forced to resign after a video showing him offering government contracts to a reported Russian oligarch's niece. Vladimir Putin's recent visit to Italy and to the Vatican 2 weeks ago also demonstrated the attraction of Italian reactionary leaders to this Russian autocrat. In an interview on the first day of the recent G20 summit, Putin openly challenged the US main-wing capitalists. He declared that, quote, the world's liberal political order has outlived its purpose, unquote, thus signaling that Europe is up for grabs. The delivery of Russian anti-missile weapons to Turkey just last week, in defiance of the US, is another example of shifting alliances. Ironically, Turkey, a NATO member, now has weapons designed to shoot down NATO missiles. Millions of workers in Europe are correct to be skeptical about the EU, a capitalist creation that has led to widespread unemployment and gross inequality. But because of the decline of class consciousness since the reversal of the communist revolutions in China and Russia, many of these workers are falling for the old divide and conquer trick of racism. In Spain, a small fascist party called Vox panders to the domestically oriented bosses, along with the disaffected, racist, and sexist working class. Emerging in 2013 as a split from the more traditional right-wing Partido Popular, Vox openly supports Israeli anti-Palestinian policy and advocates war against Iran. Vox's current leader, Santiago Abascal, launched the 2019 campaign in Covadonga, the symbolic site of the first victory of Christian Spain against Muslims who governed the Spanish peninsula for over 780 years. He calls for making Spain great again via mass deportation of Muslim workers. Abascal also wants to build a long wall on Spain's southern border to stop migrants from Morocco and other parts of northern and sub-Saharan Africa who are fleeing war and environmental catastrophe. Sound familiar? Vox is part of a broader fascist movement that has been growing in Europe and worldwide. None other than Steve Bannon founded an organization called The Movement to promote right-wing hyper-reactionary nationalist groups in Europe. Parties under this banner include the Belgian People's Party, Italy's Northern League, France's National Front, Alternative for Germany, the Danish People's Party, and the Freedom Party of Austria. Despite the alarming rise of this new generation of open fascists, I believe that the progressive neoliberals remain an even greater danger to the international working class. This is because of their current dominance and appeal to many people as so-called reformers. These mainline finance capitalists in the U.S. are committed to maintaining American control over the Middle East and its cheaply extracted oil and natural gas. They're pulling out all stops for a patriotic, multiracial mass movement to convince workers to fight and die in the next world war. They're creating reformist anti-revolutionary mass movements to channel working class anger into electoral politics and an agenda for war and fascism. When workers lack class consciousness and a communist understanding of the world, they understandably see reforming capitalism as an option for a better life. They side with one camp of capitalists or another. But relying on any capitalist side, in my view, is a lose-lose strategy for the working class. Neither the dominant progressive neoliberals nor the rising hyper-reactionary neoliberal fascists can make capitalism work for workers. They can bring us only exploitation, oppression, and living hell on earth. The rulers' deepening instability has given rise to increasing racism, sexism, nationalism, and attacks on the working class. As a new communist movement develops and immerses itself into the rulers' mass movements, injecting leftist politics, exposing capitalist hypocrisy, and fighting off the rulers' attacks, it can build confidence in the working class. This is a necessary step toward building an international communist movement and transforming capitalist wars into communist revolution. Only then will the working class be able to seize state power and lead a society for the benefit of the billions of working people, not for the profits of a handful of billionaires. And I will conclude with the words of the British communist R. Palm Dutt at the conclusion of his seminal 1934 work, Fascism and Social Revolution. And I quote, "Whatever the black hells of suffering and destruction that have still to be passed through, we face the future with the certainty and confidence of approaching power, with contempt for the barbarous antics of the doomed and decaying parasite class enemy and its final misshapen progeny of fascism, with singing hearts and glowing confidence in the future." Unquote. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. And now, Gregory.
Thank you. Good morning. Thinking about modern liberal capitalism reminds me of the Alien movies. Horrendous monsters everywhere seem to be unstoppable. Their sticky drool touches everything. No one seems to be safe. Yet our heroine, Ripley, never loses sight of the fact that there's an ultimate enemy, the mother who gives birth to the monsters and sends them out to make the world safe for her and her progeny. Isn't capitalism often pregnant with fascism and other stillborn monsters? Aren't we, the people, exhausted by the imperatives of capitalism for the creation of more and more wealth? Obscene wealth for the few and not much for the many. gross inequality, racism and misogyny, work insecurity, the existential threat of climate collapse, and the criminalization of poverty. Aren't these enough for many of us just to throw up our hands and retreat to an inner space, a sort of intellectual cocoon? How can we struggle to overcome these threats and the often pervasive feelings of powerlessness? In 1939, Max Horkheimer, a philosopher and cultural critic and an emigre from Nazi Germany, said, quote, "Whoever is not prepared to talk about capitalism should also remain silent about fascism," end quote. Let's now talk about both. Fascism is a word often used to describe anything oppressive, a term of opprobrium that conjures up the odor of sulfur. But doesn't using it that way muddle our thinking? It takes the political reality of fascism out of lived history and places it in an ahistorical zone that seems to float over our politics. Using it in this way thus masks the real nature of our political economic system, capitalism, and helps to unplug the will to struggle in a critical way for change. How can we posit a vision of the future if we don't really understand our past and present? If so, much that we characterize as bad as fascist, well, what does the word really mean? Well, fascism, as we said, was born in the womb of capitalism as part of the ongoing struggle among classes. Its most immediate antecedents can be seen in the cultural pessimism of Europe in the late 19th century and a cultural modernism that took root at the same time. Cultural pessimism was an outgrowth of increasing wealth that had as one of its artifacts the decadence that was expressed in the arts and in social mores. Sounds familiar today. Modernism in the arts also took root then and was in many ways a reaction to the perceived placidity of that time, and later found its expression in the new technology that had been developed, such as cinema, and was stimulated by the upheavals of the First World War and the Bolshevik Revolution. In Italy, the futurist movement exalted speed and metal and was a cultural forebear of the Mussolini Revolution. In the new Soviet Russia, similar movements developed, but with an exaltation of the working man and woman. In some ways, we can also see the form that the politics of classical fascism took from the left-wing Jacobinism of the French Revolution. Mass mobilization, plebiscites, the concept of the nation and sacred soil, all these can be seen in revolutionary France, and in one way or another were adopted and modified by 20th century fascism. Post-World War I Europe seemed to be a world turned upside down. The devastation of the war and the subsequent Spanish flu epidemic that caused the crippling and deaths of millions, revolutions, changes of borders with the resultant stranding of populations in newly created countries, and then followed by inflation and the coming of the Depression, all contributed to the feeling that all bets were off, or as the Cole Porter song would have it, anything goes. But the impact of all of this topsy-turvy change is that many people rightly felt that they had no part in the creation of the new political and geographic reality, that they were merely objects to be manipulated and not subjects. The elites made the changes, and the people were crammed into the back of the train, riding in the caboose, inhaling engine smoke. This led to an understandable reaction, the need for stability and order. There is no doubt that at that time capitalism was in crisis. Despite the cultural promotion of the Roaring Twenties, wages were stagnant in the US for a majority of the population, and there was a crisis in agriculture that exacerbated rural poverty. Farmers were in terrible debt and could not bring their produce to market in a way that allowed themselves to free themselves from financial chains. Debt peonage was thus rife in America. And this was also true for a majority of working class people. Of course, once the stock market crashed in 1929, all the weaknesses of American capitalism were laid bare. Overproduction led to the warehouses full of unsaleable goods. Small businesses and banks collapsed due to unpayable loans, and unemployment and underemployment soared. In the US, incipient fascist movements were developing, as exemplified by the American Legion and the America Firsters. We hear that word again. Among their historical antecedents is the anti-Catholic and anti-Irish party, the Know-Nothings of the 1850s. And of course, there is no classical fascism without anti-communism. And the Red Scare, the post-World War I bomber raids, the violence against those doing union organizing, and not to mention the racism and violence of the Ku Klux Klan and other pernicious organizations were bubbling in the heart of American society. Huey Long of Louisiana was positioning himself as a populist leader and might have ultimately been a fascist in the Mussolini mold had he not been assassinated in 1935. Today we speak of classical fascism of the first part of the 20th century and newer outgrowths such as post-fascism and neo-fascism. For a good overall definition, we could say with Samir Amin that, quote, fascism is a particular political response to the challenges with which the management of capitalist society may be confronted in specific circumstances, end quote. Well, that's quite a mouthful. So in simpler terms, what that means is that it is part of the toolkit used when needed by the ruling elites in the ongoing class war to combat challenges to their hegemony. The classical fascism of Mussolini, Hitler, Franco, and others was always willing to manage society and the government without challenging the fundamental principles of capitalism itself. Even though fascists gave virulent speeches about plutocracy or capitalism, and we can hear that echo today, they were fundamentally blowing smoke in order to appeal to the masses. In fact, under fascist governments, profits were generally up for major firms who were then able to buy out smaller ones who could not adhere to new regulations that were instituted as the countries prepared for war. In all cases where fascism ultimately became the dominant political form, the support of big business and other conservative forces, such as churches, were a crucial factor in the rise of fascism. When a capitalist society is in crisis, the clear fascist choice is the subversion and rejection of democracy. This rejection throws out the diversity of opinions, standard electoral procedures, or the guarantee of the rights of the minority, and instead inserts the principle of submission to a leader and his myrmidons. Ideas tend to be backward-looking, with a concomitant promotion of national myths and political and historical fairy tales. As an example, we can clearly see that today in India, where the Modi reactionary government is downgrading the accomplishments of the Mughal Islamic period and rewriting history to falsely embellish Hindu rulers, as well as in other places where race and nation become touchstones of the ruling ideology. The reactionary nature of plebiscites becomes clear, as their use destroys the process of collective leadership and instead substitutes a relationship between people and leader, the nation and the chief. They have the effect of reducing complex issues to a simple binary. And a current example was the referendum in the UK regarding Brexit, in which the manipulation and twisting of facts became the locus of politics, and victimhood is a theme carried to ridiculous extremes. The ruler, in his or her embodiment of the nation, becomes a victim in a perverse retelling of the story of the Christ. Witness Duterte in the Philippines, complaining that the criticisms of women regarding his brutality and misogyny are a hurtful limiting of his rights to speech. Poor Duterte's the victim, he who has advocated rape and the shooting of women in the vagina. The spectacle, mass rallies, torchlight parades, simplistic speeches that negatively characterize the other and promote national myths becomes another substitute for the exercising of a critical politics. The education of the young primarily consists of drumming in their heads the idea of overall submission to a leader and intellectual submission to the national myths propagated by the leading circles. There is also a strong reinforcing relationship between fascism and the irrational. Some of its features are the cult of combat, a romantic impulse to create a national mystique, the concomitant invention of a mystical past, and the creation of a modern and toxic masculinity with a circumscribed role for women as nurturers and birthing factories. Again, late 19th century cultural pessimism followed by post-World War I reactionary modernism helped to set the stage for revolutionary fascism and its marriage to the irrational. As I touched on earlier, anti-communism is an essential feature of classical fascism. The aborted attempts at revolution outside Bolshevik Russia led to a growing fear of Judeo-Bolshevism. As Walter Benjamin pithily stated, behind every fascism is a failed revolution. This year marks the 100th anniversary of the murders of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, the leaders of the failed Spartacus uprising in Berlin, and surely Benjamin had that in mind. In Germany, the fratricidal struggle between the Social Democrats and the Communists fatally weakened the repressive forces and left an opening for the conservative forces to install Hitler. The emasculation of unions and political parties that support workers' rights also became a prime focus of the fascist political project. This focus, along with the loosening of regulations that may constrain businesses other than those regarding production for the military, were a boon to the capitalist class. One other important concept to explore is the relationship between coercion and consent. We all know that outright coercion, the fear of punishment, loss, and death, can manufacture consent. This is clearly evident in the classical fascism of the 20th century. In our era, we will have to explore how more subtle uses of coercion, such as the thought that there is no alternative, can be used to manufacture consent. But let's turn to the 21st century. Some new terms have entered our political lexicon, such as post-fascism and neo-fascism. Another word that has a longer pedigree extending back to the 19th century is populism. It has been and is being used to describe forces both on the left and the right. We need to explore these concepts in some detail. Populism is never one set thing. It has many elements that are constantly changing and combining. In the United States, 130 years ago, populism was seen as a revolt by the smaller agricultural elements against the bankers and major industrial combines that we talked about. It also questioned the stability of the greenback. That's a good punctuation. Of a greenback and what lay behind the value of money. Today, in the USA and Europe, populism is mostly viewed as a right-wing phenomenon, but much of its rhetoric rails against the elite and how they have ignored the common woman man, and to some degree is an echo of much of what was said by many in Occupy in the US and Podemos in Spain. However, the populist parties in Europe, for example, as Danny mentioned, are characterized by xenophobia and racism and exist precisely to exclude the most marginal elements of society, particular immigrants and non-Christians. Marco Ravelli is thus right to define right-wing populism as a senile disorder of liberal democracy, a revolt of the included white Christians who have been pushed to the margins. See what Trump is talking about. Left-wing populism, on the other hand, tries to be inclusive and supports the struggles of people of color and immigrants, while also railing against the elite, the 1% and their institutions. Right-wing populism gives lip service to democracy and participates in the electoral process, but similarly to the fascism of old, gives pride of place to national myths, and today feeds the flames of worry over demographic changes that they feel will see their societies overrun by overrun by a sea of brown, the others. Both left and right-wing populism, for the most part, do not either see a way to overcome the neoliberal project, or they have made peace with it. Populism is more a style than an ideology. It exalts the people, however defined, versus the elite. Populism is against the system, and it has as many snakes as Medusa's head has. It can be applied to a plethora of groups, and it says more about those who use it than as a political definition. It is extremely fungible, and it tends to erase a clear definition between the left and the right. The 20th century progressive revolutions have mostly been defeated and or transformed. For most of us, elections serve as an interruption to our politically quiescent existence and do not usher in fundamental changes. Capitalism is not transcendent. It lives on, continuously throwing up contradictions that it has to overcome with new forms of consent and oppression. The social democratic parties, and that includes the Democratic Party in the US, embraced anti-communism and neoliberalism and left the door open for alternative reactionary forces to appear. At this point, the radical right is the greatest force opposed to the system. It is xenophobic, Islamophobic, nationalistic, and embraces authoritarianism, bigotry, and social tyranny, but it is not anti-capitalist. In many ways similar to classical fascism, right-wing populism gives the masses the illusion of being actors as opposed to being spectators. We need only look at Orban's Hungary and other autocratic states to see the truth of this. So post-fascism and neo-fascism, two words, two realities that were birthed by the same mother and describe some of the challenges we faced. Post-fascism can be seen as a magnetic field where different movements, parties, and regimes can locate themselves. Steve Bannon is diligently working to create a right-wing international that will serve as a nourishing movement for autocratic parties and regimes, where tactics and strategies can be devised to promote reactionary utopias in which nationalism is the civic religion and traditional religion can become a support for a reactionary hegemonic project. Right-wing populism is part of the story, and the lines between it and post-fascism are increasingly blurred. They do not, as classical fascism did not, seek to overturn capitalism and replace it with a different socioeconomic system. They often will keep representative democracy as a soft way to help manage consent, and for the most part will eschew outright violence and use the legal system and enforcement of old and newly created laws as a way of keeping people in line. Post-fascism in Europe and the US is enriched by the soil of cultural despair and victimhood. Demographic changes, they say, are ruining the nation, and uppity women are fomenting male impotence, thus lowering the birth rate for the desired type of babies, Christian and white. Spectacle will be an important part of the rule by reactionary forces. Propaganda that exalts the nation and its myths, along with the drumming into people's heads that there is no alternative, that to dream progressive dreams as traitors will be weapons used to keep challenges at bay. Of course, if people begin to revolt and the ruling circles see that they may be in danger, soft tactics will give way to outright violence to enforce consent. Suspension of civil liberties and the rule of law, however flawed, and the hard tactics of consent will come to the fore. Neo-fascism is a term that can be applied to those movements who look to the past of classical fascism as their inspiration for the future. Not for them the niceties of representative democracy or the fine edges of the legal system. For them, the cudgel is always near to hand, and they make very little attempt to hide their racism. They want a leader who can embody their toxic ideas and imply them while inspiring the masses to crush the other. They even like dressing up in uniforms that echo those of Mussolini, black shirts, or Hitler, brown shirts, with badges that are slightly different from those worn by classical fascists. We can sometimes view them as ridiculous holdovers from the past, but we do so at our peril. Before concluding, I just want to take a little side journey. We live in an era where space has temporarily counted time. And what does that mean? It signifies a time when the citizen has been replaced by the consumer, when the city has become all-pervasive, both physically and culturally, and where the old quotidian rhythms no longer apply. Sowing, reaping, and harvesting, they're foreign to most of us. We are familiar with rats and pigeons, but not so much with foxes and orioles. The contrast between the city and the country is no longer so defined. We leave the city to find ourselves in a suburban space of sameness, where most of us are watching the same programs on television, or landing on the same websites, and having many of our experiences mediated by digital devices. In a way, time, as our forebears knew it, no longer exists. But time may yet have the last laugh. In the wildly popular television program, Game of Thrones, there is the meme, winter is coming. For us, this meme should be, the storm is coming. Today, nature may seem to be vanquished by the ocean of concrete and glass that covers our landmass, but nature's power has yet to be fully shown. It has unwittingly been augmented by the carbon and methane that we have pumped into the air and oceans over the last 200 years. We have created our own super Godzilla that is ready to put paid to our pretensions of mastery. But against this monster that is ready to lay waste to our world, our potential army of the young and the committed of any age that is ready to do battle with our own thoughtless selves. This army may yet find an ally in nature and time as it struggles to find a new balance for our planetary metabolism. But let's return from our short but monstrous side trip to consider our possible future as we struggle with the earthly, political monsters of late capitalism, reactionary populism as it grows into post-fascism, and the festering detritus of neo-fascism, all nourished by selfishness, misanthropy, and austerity, and overlaid by the reality of impending climate change. It has been said that when snakes begin to move to higher ground, it is a harbinger of floods to come. So what are we to make of the 1/10 of 1% buying up homes in New Zealand or in decommissioned missile silos as safe havens? The past 40 years of neoliberal policies has eviscerated the left. Unions and working class parties have either been terribly wounded or kept at extreme margins. Left parties and movements in Europe are tearing themselves apart over the question of immigration. It is sad to say that today, at the left, for the most part, exhibits a critical thought as sophisticated as it is politically impotent. Still, there are many sparks of hope that are ready to burst forth in new types of progressive actions. Awareness of the environmental challenges has grown immensely. The neoliberal nostrums are beginning to lose their power over many people's lives. Many of us are daring to dream again, progressive dreams to counter our rebarbative reality. Perhaps we will begin to worry a bit less about protecting differences and more about extending equality. Hope is slowly, tentatively spreading its wings to shelter us as we imagine a different type of future that in the past we took for granted. What will the confluence of environmental stresses and political reaction bring? Who can say? But I know that without hope and action to build a different future, a crippling entropy will control us. We have to take action and be the subjects of our present and future reality. I am neither an optimist nor a pessimist, as both words imply a lack of thought. They are an emotional response to situations that require critical thinking, as painful and difficult as that may be. I have hope, but hope must be put into action. Actions that will lead to transcending capitalism and closing off the path to neo-fascism and other stillborn monsters of late capitalism, among which we must include the environmental challenges we face. And yes, there is no alternative under capitalism. So let's dream, let's act progressively so that we can ensure that our future is not behind us. Thank you.
Well, there's a lot to chew on here, and I invite you to share your thoughts, your questions. Not long speeches, but we'll be open to your views, your opinions, as well as questions. Okay, starting here.
Well, Dan, thank you for providing this, and I'm wondering if...
Arturo.
Oh, okay. Excuse me. Thank you for providing
It's a
this.
sheer definition.
And I'm wondering if the both of you, since you have presented presentations, might put that on the Global Justice webpage. It was a lot to assimilate at one time, and I would appreciate that. That's my comment.
Yeah, well, it is being videoed
Oh,
to go on our website, but also hopefully we'll have the text of the presenters that can go there as well.
thank you.
Okay, anyone else? Yes.
Well, would you say that the current election with the number of Democratic candidates offers some hope? Certainly a more enlightened election time with fewer bromides and more ideas.
Anyone else to respond to anything?
I'll take a stab at it.
Okay.
I think that there is such frustration in the United States that various sectors of the population are feeling the great need for expression and the clarification of that expression to make a launch for something new. Bernie Sanders opened the discussion, but in a way that only invited challenges, and those challenges may work to help and accelerate the clarification that is being undertaken. Various sectors, whether it's Pete Buttigieg or Elizabeth Warren, pressing a kind of alternative But as Gregory pointed out, no one is challenging capital. And unless capital is challenged at its core, we make no progress. It's often said that the New Deal resuscitated capital. As a matter of fact, the New Deal organized capital to rationalize and clarify its need for a kind of management that it couldn't undertake on its own. What Morgan initiated in 1907 during the crisis to create the Fed as a secret organization, as I alluded to earlier, had to be formally organized under a, shall we say, a quasi-liberal, neo-liberal, because we U.S. Americans have to clarify between what liberalism is. And what they did was bring the forcing consent of the South for necessary changes, and the North, which in the first years from about 1933 or so into the mid-Depression acceleration of the crisis, they made a huge attempt, which basically failed for reasons that we can discuss, which are vital to us. Then, during the war, the entire process of capital production was rationalized with great resistance. So what I think is beginning to occur here is an effort from many, many voices to make a clear challenge to the right, which is not succeeding.
Yeah, Gregory?
Confusion reigns. I think that's clear to all of us. We who have been slumbering for a long time are awakened by what's going on. And as you said, there's a plethora of candidates all across a kind of liberal perspective of what they want. But the crisis that we face, the environmental challenges, which I think are the number one existential crisis facing us, and which are being addressed by grassroots movements like Extinction Rebellion, both in Europe and here, and a lot of young people, and in which the Green New Deal is a stab at trying to put that into perspective, is something that is good, that it's obviously coming out of this. But I am not clear what the end result, I mean, none of us are clear, obviously, but I don't have a lot of hope that the election is going to change a lot. Number one, Trump may win again, and I think that's a very strong possibility, quite strong at this point. Secondly, unless the candidate, whoever he or she happens to end up being to challenge Trump, will take the message that appeals to his base and also has a message that also appeals to that base. And that's what Sanders did and is trying to do to a great extent. I don't think you'll have much of a change. And people, that's why, as I said, we've said, the right-wing forces are the ones who have really positioned themselves as really challenging this system. And unless the people on the left really show themselves to be challenging that system, not just in an intellectual way, but in a physical way, it dampens my level of hope. So that's what needs to be done. If it's going to be more of the same, if it's going to be Obama #2, not going to cut it, not going to change things. We have a crisis.
A physical.
Dan, were you going to say something?
Well, yeah, I basically agree. I just briefly, I think there are a lot of exciting struggles going on, different local and national groups doing different things. Yesterday, I was following while
Can't hear you.
Yesterday, I was following live while a group called Never Again took over the ICE office in Washington, D.C., and I think that was exciting. There's a lot of things happening that are exciting, and I think that some of the issues that are brought up by the Democratic candidates, like income inequality, racism, climate change to a certain extent, I mean, these are all important issues that could be helpful for the left to raise further discussion. But I agree with both my colleagues that I don't think any of the candidates, the Democratic candidates, if they were to win, really are offering a fundamental challenge to the capitalist system that's really behind most of the suffering of the majority of the people in the U.S. and most of the world. And so I wouldn't look at any of these candidates as a savior to remediate the problems we're talking about. But I think participation in discussion and in mass movements around some of the issues that are raised in the debate, could be helpful for the left to grow.
Can I add a comment here? I guess it was Arturo who mentioned that capitalism searches for order. And that was what brings to mind the Mussolini's definition of fascism as the marriage of the state and corporations. The state becoming the mechanism for establishing the kind of order that is needed in the light of the competitive relationship that exists between corporations. Now, the New Deal in the United States was a different approach to that. We got the regulatory state that brought order into a capitalist system that was in crisis during the Great Depression. And what we're seeing now as a major component of what is happening under the Trump administration is as Steve Bannon called it, the deconstruction of the administrative state. Deconstructing, destroying the regulatory mechanisms of the state. And behind all of the tweets and the other distractions that the media has so obsessed on has been an ongoing program to eliminate regulations as extensively as possible, basically promoting an unregulated, unrestrained, rampant capitalism, which could end up being quite destructive of capitalism in the long run, because capitalism does need order, and it's the state that has provided that order historically, and it's exactly that is now being removed under the kind of neoliberal principles that have been guiding the Trump administration, and that has also been embraced by the Democratic establishment as well.
And many of that deregulation started under Clinton and continued under Obama as well.
Yep. Yeah. Yes.
I would invite the panelists to comment on this situation. assume Trump wins in 2020. Project briefly as you can what happens to the U.S. and the world during the next phase of his administration.
Anyone want to look into the crystal ball?
Nightmare. Let's talk about nightmare.
Sure. Okay.
Despite the fact I'm a clumsy person, and when I woke up this morning, my crystal ball, which is on my night table, I jostled it and it fell down and it smashed into 1,000 pieces, which may be a good metaphor for what you're talking about. Clearly, what we see as a slow-moving and a not so many cases slow-moving disaster on so many areas is going to accelerate, because the feeling of unleashing is going to be there. Let loose the hounds of war and cry havoc, Shakespeare said. And you're going to have more of that. And more people are going to be upset and are going to be flowing into the streets to combat that. At the same time, right-wing forces are going to be mobilized against this threat, which is going to be perceived as the others and brown people and all that kind of stuff. And there will be a tremendous amount of violent struggle, I think, if that is to occur. And I think it is a likely scenario, because I think right now Trump has a very good chance of being re-elected. So we have to prepare for those things and think critically about where we're going to go and organize, and organize on the local level, but also nationally and internationally.